Hi, folks. So I just wanted to go live to basically explain my tweet. I've seen a lot of people asking many questions and a lot of people making many comments, and I wanted to explain this tweet and clarify just the background of where this tweet essentially came from, and what it actually means, and also give a bit of background when it comes to how Muslims actually think about these things. So just to remind everyone of the tweet, I basically said that I was never a practicing observant Muslim. Yet even I wanted Islam to take over Europe and the West until I was a teenager, which was about the time when I was basically stopped believing in Islam. Just to clarify this, I'll actually show you the tweet just so you're aware of what we're discussing. Bear with me for a moment. Here we go. Right. So as you can see, this is my tweet. I said I was never a practicing observant Muslim, yet even I wanted Islam to take over Europe and the West until I was a teenager. We are taught that Islam's greatest achievements are conquest and colonialism. We are taught that the greatest thing we could ever do is enable the invasion and conquest of non Muslim countries. This is a fact that only a former Muslim would tell you. And that's the end of my tweet. So, this is 100% how I felt until I was a teenager. And to explain, how this is, how, to explain a bit of about my background, I come from a very, what you would call a moderate family. It's, an Egyptian moderate family. My mom is a Muslim, my dad was a Muslim. Everyone I've ever known was a Muslim. I was born in Egypt in 1990 and grew up in Cairo, in a pretty nice location, pretty nice part of Cairo. So, a very middle class, well educated. I attended an American school, so, I was taught uh, German, French, English. All of my education was actually in English because it was an American school. And despite this, I was, until I was a teenager, which is, again, like I said, is about the time when I actually stopped believing in Islam. I did want to see Islam taking over Europe. I didn't want to see Islam taking over the West. Although, as I said, I grew up, in an American school. I grew up, watching, Friends, watching all of that stuff, and watching mostly American produced TV. So it was, this was, my life. I was surrounded by Americans. I was surrounded by the most open minded people you can imagine. My family was very open minded. I don't even remember my mom or dad praying, when we were that young. As we got older, yes, my parents started praying more, but my relationship with Islam was mostly. I'll just stop sharing this. So my relationship with Islam was mostly, Friday prayers. You go to, your prayers on Friday because that's what everyone does, and that's essentially it. What's very interesting is when you look at this, you actually start to see, that this is basically as moderate as it gets for Muslims. And despite this, I grew up, again, hoping that one day Islam would take over the West, hoping that one day Islam would take over Europe, America, all that stuff. And that's mostly, I would say, because we are taught that this is the greatest achievement of Islam. The greatest achievement of Islam is conquest. The greatest achievement of Islam is essentially invasion. It's taking over non-Muslim land and making this non-Muslim land Muslim. Uh, and I actually believe this is, again, as I said, despite my family being very moderate, this is what we were taught because I was given the name Khalid. Just to give you a bit of background about my name. So my dad called me Khalid after Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid ibn al-Walid was a man who, is he is what you can describe or what is often described in Islam as one of the companions of the Muslim Prophet Muhammad. So companion, is basically a group of people who were the contemporaries of Muhammad. They lived with him. They witnessed essentially, him. going from a man who was just, an Arab like everyone else, who was, believed in the religion which they believed in, which was mostly, he was mostly a pagan, and he essentially worshipped, like little stones, statues of gods, the gods of the Arabs, basically. And then he decided that he was a prophet, or the story of Islam, that he became a prophet. He received, the divine message from Allah, and he became a prophet. So he has his companions. Khalid ibn Walid is one of them. I am named after Khalid ibn Walid. And I remember my dad, basically telling me, I named you after Khalid ibn Walid, who was referred to in Islam as Saif Allah al Maslul, as in the drawn sword of Allah. Drawn as in, this is a drawn sword, as in ready to be used. And that's because this man was very effective in battle. He was very effective. He was very brutal. He was very bloodthirsty. And I was named after him. He was a man who, again, this is the Muslim narrative. He was very good at horse riding. He was, a great knight. He was very brave. He was never defeated in battle, and that's why my dad named me after him. Now, when you look at this, when you are taught that this is essentially it, when you are taught that this is the man you're named after, this is your namesake. Obviously, that puts many ideas in your little head as a child. And I remember, my father also used to say, I'm teaching you horse riding, swimming, and shooting because that's what Islam and that's what the Prophet Muhammad said you should teach your kids. علموا أولادكم الرماية وركوب الخيل والسباحة. So swimming, shooting, and horse riding. And I loved horse riding. I loved going horse riding by the pyramids. And every time I went horse riding by the pyramids, I would imagine myself, imagine a 10-year-old named after a man who he is told is one of the most amazing knights, and he was undefeated in battle, and he used to be amazing on his horse, and I had an Arabian horse, so I was, as you can imagine, very proud of myself, very proud of being given this name, and I was told that again, this is the name that I should live up to. Now, if you look at Khalid ibn al-Walid, I describe Khalid ibn Walid as a war criminal. He was a man who was incredibly cruel and incredibly brutal and absolutely bloodthirsty. This is on an unbelievable scale, essentially. If you look at what Khalid did, so there was something called the Wars of Apostasy at some point, and the Wars of Apostasy, I think it was around 630 or 620. I can't really remember this, around this date, basically. And the Wars of Apostasy happened after the Prophet Muhammad died. Some people who, were Muslim, some people who believed in Islam had actually decided, you know what, I'm going to continue to believe in Islam, but I'm not going to send my zakah, the money or the charity or whatever it is, back to the center of the Islamic Caliphate. So I'm going to keep my money for my city, for my people. Some people also, after Muhammad died, decided, you know what, we were essentially forcibly converted. So Muhammad came, he led an army, and he basically forced us to convert. Because he used to say a statement that's very well known, actually, a statement that he also sent to many leaders of many countries before the Muslim armies invaded. He used to say, Islamu taslamu, which basically means if you believe in Islam, if you become Muslim, if you embrace Islam, you will be safe. If you don't, then you won't be safe. And there's actually a letter still kept somewhere, like somewhere, as in a museum somewhere, of this letter. The letter sent by Muhammad telling people, Islamu taslamu, embrace Islam and you shall be safe. So it's an ultimatum. If you don't embrace Islam, you will not be safe. Your land will be invaded, and we will basically take over your land. So in that, that's essentially what I was taught. That's essentially, again, the mindset of the Muslim invasions. So Khalid ibn Walid played a key role in these wars that led to the conquest and invasion of other places. And again, he was called the drawn sword of Allah. And during the wars of apostasies, as I mentioned, the wars of apostasy, Khalid ibn Walid comes across a man. His name is Malik bin Nuwair, and essentially beheads him. So Malik is a man who is, he's the leader of a community somewhere in Arabia, and he decides, I am not going to send you, the zakat. I'm not going to send you the money that I should keep locally for my people. Imagine like he's a mayor essentially. He's the mayor of Manchester or whatever, and he refuses to send the money to the state, to the treasury of the Islamic Caliphate. So what Khalid did is, Khalid ibn Walid, he essentially decided to behead him. So he cuts off his head and he decides to eat out of his head, his severed head, to terrorize everyone else. Basically, he's making an example of him that to other community leaders, if you don't send your zakat to us, we're going to essentially behead you, murder you, and make an example of you. So he cuts off his head and decides to eat out of his severed head. So imagine a man sat with a man's severed head and he's eating out of his head. And on that same night when he killed him, he decided that he is going to actually also marry his wife, or basically not marry her, but take her as, war exploits essentially. And he took his wife as his own. So on that very same night when he killed her husband, he took his wife and essentially raped her. The problem is, you might say this all that stuff is seventh century nonsense. This stuff happened, in again medieval times. This is barbaric. All cultures were barbaric back then, and that is true. Many cultures back then were barbaric. We're not denying this. Many cultures, especially in Africa and the Middle East, were very barbaric. I believe none were as barbaric as the Islamic culture, but anyway, regardless, you might say this is stuff that happened in the seventh century, and we can move on. The problem is Muslims are the only ones who still glorify that stuff. They still glorify medieval, bloodthirsty murder and terrorism to this very day, which is why my parents named me after this man, Khalid ibn Walid. So instead of actually, basically pointing to these incidents or those people as examples of horror, this is medieval horror basically. They chose not to do this. They chose to look at these people and teach us that those people are people that we should look up to. Those people are role models that we should live up to. And they named us after them. So imagine, if you go to Germany and you find, Germans still calling their sons, Hitler essentially, and saying Hitler was an amazing man. It's not very different if you ask me. Or imagine, you go somewhere to, in England and you find that people are still calling their sons after, some crusader who was incredibly brutal, and murdered everyone. Or imagine, people in Europe calling their sons Vlad after Vlad, then, the Impaler or whatever. It really is quite unbelievable. If you look at all this, you're going to realize that yes, horrible stuff happened in the medieval times, but only Muslims continue to glorify that stuff to this very day. And that's really seriously challenging. And I'm also not talking about like fringe groups or people who do not count or people who could be just speaking for themselves or whatever it is. I'm talking about people who actually are mainstream. I'm talking about the overwhelming majority of Muslims. They still glorify medieval war crimes and terrorism and the most horrific crimes imaginable. So if we go to Egypt's Al Azhar, for example, Al Azhar is basically the biggest and the oldest mainstream Sunni educational institute. It's like the Vatican for Muslims, for Sunni Muslims. And I want to show you how they still view this. Because that's the serious problem that I personally have. This is not something small, this is something really, really, really serious. So I just want to show you exactly what's a couple of years ago, this is what we saw. We saw the Imam Al-Azhar, so this is, sorry, they just have a lot of, most Arab websites are quite annoying to be honest. Anyway, so the Imam of Al-Azhar, Sheikh Al-Azhar, is saying that Muslim conquests were not colonialist. The teachings of the religion, as in Islam, guaranteed people happy lives. So he's basically saying that the teachings of Islam guaranteed people, wherever the invasions, the Muslim conquests and invasions happened, guaranteed the people who were being invaded happy lives. So imagine anyone telling you, what the French did, invading places in North Africa, what the Italians did, invading places in Africa, or what the British did, invading places in Africa, was actually to make people happy. That was the purpose. And that the teachings of Islam, of Christianity, or European culture made people who were being invaded in Africa really delighted and happy to be invaded. That's basically what he's saying. Muslims are the only ones who refuse to recognize that the conquest was actually colonialist at all. I'm going to show you another example that's very interesting, but right after we read this. So you're going to see that essentially he's saying, these invasions were not colonialist, and he is also saying that the Quran, the Muslim holy book, is the secret behind the success of the Muslim conquests. And he's basically saying, that this is actually a very funny statement because I find it really quite unusual for anyone to say anything like this. He's saying that many, I'll read you the exact quote. Many of the West's scientists and researchers have concluded that the secret behind the success of the Muslim conquests is the Quran and the teaching of Islam, which guaranteed people happy lives. End of quote. So you have a man here saying this is essentially a lie. He's basically saying that people in the West, researchers in the West, scientists in the West, have decided or have concluded with the research that essentially, you know, uh, it really is unbelievable. That basically they decided that the Quran and the teaching of Islam guaranteed that people were, really happy uh, with that. Oh, sorry, actually, I'm sharing the wrong one. My apologies. I had very little sleep. Yeah, so he's essentially saying that Islam and the teachings of Islam guaranteed that people were really happy, and it's. I mean, if you ask me, that's not only that's not only nonsense. This is just completely unbelievable. Uh, let's just share it because I think you can see now. There we go. Yes, I think you see it now. That's the quote I was referring to. He's saying that many scientists and researchers in the West have concluded that the reason behind the success of Muslim conquests is the Quran. And he also says that pretty much the reason that Muslims were able to change non Muslim land and convert non Muslim land into Muslim land is because of Islam. He's basically saying that Islam was the reason and the inspiration behind the success, and he mentioned this explicitly, the success of the invasion and the conquest of North African countries. So you have a man who's openly admitting that Muslims took over many parts of the world by force, converted non Muslim land, and he mentions Egypt, he mentions North Africa specifically, which were not Muslim land, and they made them forcibly Muslim land. And he's basically saying that Islam is the reason behind this massive, success essentially. And to really highlight what this means and to show you how Muslims view these things, I just want to show you a small comment to my tweet, which I also posted on my Slack. So I said on my that I was never a practicing observant Muslim, the same stuff I said on Twitter, and this is the response of a Muslim woman. Her name is Ibtisam. She identifies as an agriculture engineer, and here is what she says: in Islam, there is no such concept as colonialism. When a state is integrated through Islamic conquests, its resources are not plundered, its women are not enslaved, and its people are neither subjected to forced ignorance or stripped of their identity, unlike the practices of Western colonialism, particularly what was inflicted upon Muslim nations. Quite the contrary, Islamic openings refers to conquests, but openings specifically is a word that only Muslims use to describe conquest, to describe invasion, because they believe that these are divine openings. That God, the Almighty, decided to open up a nation to Islam. So for example, Egypt, Egypt was not a Muslim country; it was a majority Christian country. Actually, at the time it was invaded around the year 640, I believe. Around the time it was invaded by Muslim armies, and they referred to the invasion and conquest of Egypt as the opening of Egypt. So to go back to what she was saying, she's saying quite the contrary. Islamic openings preserve existing schools and local cultures while granting individuals the freedom to practice their own faiths. Furthermore, they focus on reforming and developing the state, precisely as the Arab Muslims did in Al Andalus, the proof of which remains clearly visible in Spain today. So, I have many problems with that statement, obviously, as you can imagine, but my main problem is it's the beginning of that statement when she says, in Islam, there is no such concept as colonialism. You see, colonialism, mostly it's defined as the invasion of any land by force and basically subjecting this land to, your own rule. Whether, you do this economically, you do this in whichever way, but basically you invade a country and you make it your own and you basically exploit their economy, their communities, again, whether it's politically, economically, militarily, you basically exploit that country and you become the decision maker for that country, which is what we saw. You basically turn yourself into the ruler of that country, which is what Muslims from Arabia, or what is known today as Saudi Arabia, did to Egypt. So she says this is not colonialism, although this is the very definition of the word colonialism. But she says in Islam there is no such thing as colonialism. So what really annoys me about this, it actually makes me really angry, I'm not going to lie to you. We have someone who's basically suggesting that when Muslims invade land, when there is a Muslim army invading a non-Muslim country and taking it by force and converting the people to Islam by force and making sure that whatever economic resources this country has, whether it's the taxes that the people pay, whatever it is transferred from this country to the capital of the Islamic Caliphate outside of this country. And then people who are not Egyptian, people who are not from the local community, people who are not local community leaders, they decide how that money is spent. She believes that none of this is colonialism. This is like me basically walking into your house, not walking, breaking into your house, opening the fridge and deciding I'm going to basically eat your food and telling you this is not breaking in. This is not an act of, criminality. You should be lucky that I'm doing this because I'm kind and I'm here while I'm eating your food. I might also give you a sandwich. And that's unheard of. It's quite literally unheard of. Imagine the Pope. He stands, on during some sermon in the Vatican. He stands somewhere and he decides, I'm going to refer to the Crusades as a divine opening of non-Christian countries to Christianity, And I'm going to tell the people, people of the Levant, like Syria, like, Israel, that you were invaded by the Crusaders, and this was a divine act from Christ, and you should be very grateful because when the Crusaders came to your country, they also built some schools, they also built some hospitals. And that is an act of kindness. They were there to look after you. This was not colonialism. This was not invasion. They were just looking after you. I mean, fuck this. Fuck this. This is unbelievable. I mean, in every way, this is unbelievable. Like I said, imagine someone walking into your house, raping your wife, beating up your kids, eating your food, and telling you this is not colonialism. I'm just here to look after your fucking family. I mean, the problem is this woman actually isn't lying. I'm gonna have to show you again what she was saying because I cannot quite believe that some people have the audacity to make something. So let's go back to what she was saying again. It's just unbelievable. I couldn't actually believe it. And I'll show you also how she engages with others. So she is saying right here, again, in Islam, there is no such concept as colonialism when a state is integrated through Islamic conquests. So a state is not invaded, a state is not, you know, colonized, a state is integrated through Islamic conquests. Imagine if Britain today decides, you know what, we're going to take over Egypt. But this is not colonialism, this is not invasion. We are integrating Egypt through Christian or European values. It's really tough, it's really, really difficult. Actually, sort of, I want you to imagine what you would say to such a person. What can you actually say to convince such a person that what she's saying is nonsense? She's not lying, she's not deliberately lying. She actually believes in that stuff. Because I used to have this, I used to, talk to my mom, for example. And I used to say, this was again around the time when I was a teenager and started to actually question Islam, started to feel like, hold on, there is something wrong here. And I used to tell my mom, we are Egyptians. We, before Islam, we were Egyptian. And she would say, we are grateful for the Islamic openings, which, conquests, because these Islamic openings made us Muslims. So we are very grateful for the Muslim armies who came to our land, took our land, and turned us into Muslims. Now let's go back to the rest of that conversation. So I said everything you said is a statement that indicates a terrifying level of ignorance, which I believe it is. And let's see some responses now because she said something quite interesting that I again, it's something that's really, really difficult to actually believe. Hold on a moment. It's really quite slow. Oh, where did her? Oh, yes. So she's saying, where is the ignorance in the subject? She's clearly, I think, using Google Translate or something. Or actually, this might be my own device, I think, because she responded to me in Arabic. I responded in Arabic as well at some point, and she responded in Arabic. Anyway, she goes on telling people that essentially, hold on a moment, let me. Yeah, so that's another response. Yes, I included this example, the killing of Malik ibn Nuwaira. And I said, Khalid ibn Walid killed, because she was saying, basically she doesn't understand what colonialism is. She doesn't understand how, uh, what we're discussing essentially. And she's saying that when Muslims invaded, they allowed the people essentially to practice their religious rituals with complete comfort. So when Muslims invaded Egypt, they allowed Christians and others to practice the religion with complete comfort, as she says. And she says this is unfortunately what we do not find with the West. which is really, really peculiar, given the fact that we now have almost 6 million Muslims in Britain and they all can go to mosques and they can all worship and they can all pray perfectly fine, but we don't have even churches allowed in Saudi Arabia. There are no churches allowed in Saudi Arabia. You are not allowed to even be a non Muslim police officer. There is no such thing. There is no one in the entire Saudi government who is non Muslim. You're going to see that, they hire executives, for, investments, for all that stuff because they want to appeal to the West. But you're never going to see a minister or, a deputy minister or even an assistant of a minister or even a police officer or even an army officer who's not Muslim. They usually use labor from countries like Pakistan, like Egypt, like other places, even in the military if they have to, because they do need, people who are basically people who come from countries with more experience when it comes to security and defense. So they always get them from Pakistan. Anyway, it's really quite a fascinating statement to make. And then you see a really great example of Muslim anti-Semitism, where she says everyone knows that God exiled the Jews and they no longer have a land of their own, and the proof of this is that they are scattered in every corner of the earth. Palestine, no matter how long or short it takes, will never belong to the Jews and it will remain Muslim until the day of judgment. So the day of judgment is another big story because, eschatology in Sunni and Shia Islam is actually very common in many ways. And both, versions, whether it's Sunni or Shia Islam, include the ethnic cleansing of Jews. So this is, the last war, the war to end all wars. Jews will be ethnically cleansed from the Holy Land, from Israel, and that's basically the end of times. So again, my problem with Muslims is not only that they don't actually believe that there can be Muslim conquest. They believe that there can be that these are not actually conquests, that this is not actually colonialism, and they continue to glorify pretty much, the leaders of these wars, these very bloody wars, and these acts of terrorism and crimes against humanity continue to be glorified, continue to be celebrated. Muslims continue to name their children, like my parents named me, after one of the most horrific people on in history. Basically, I mean, that's how I would say it. Really, Khalid ibn Walid. Also, what's very interesting about him, he actually waved a banner that had the stamp, that had basically the stamp of the Muslim Prophet Muhammad. So it said, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad Rasulullah. Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. So that banner, because we also have copies of this, because he used the stamp to in letters that he sent to countries that were about to be invaded by the Muslims, and it's exactly what ISIS uses. ISIS, as in the Islamic Caliphate in Iraq and Syria. So the Islamic Caliphate in Iraq and Syria is based on and inspired by what Muhammad and his companions did. And that's just a matter of fact. We see this in the fact that they also use the same flag with the stamp of Muhammad, and they also use the same methods. So, if they go and invade a country, they believe that they can take the women as sex slaves, just like Khalid ibn Walid did. That's actually true, like that's recognized by Muslim scholars, and I will show you next time in our conversation. I will show you a very, very prominent Egyptian Muslim scholar who is also linked to a university in Spain. And he talks about this. He talks about how it is allowed in Islam. He's talking about this, I mean, a couple of months ago. He wasn't talking about this years ago. This is a man who is probably in his 40s. He's got a PhD from Spain in Islamic studies, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And he's also got a PhD from Egypt, or a master's degree at least from Egypt. And his area of expertise is the history of Islam. And he talks about this from a serious, serious point of authority and knowledge and expertise. And he talks about this openly. He says in Islam we are allowed, if you kill a man, you are allowed to take his wife as a sex slave. And that's what's happening today. This is what Hamas did when they invaded Israel. They just took women as sex slaves. This is what ISIS did when they invaded, or took over parts of Iraq and Syria. They took the women as sex slaves, and they also pretty much took, whatever they could get their hands on, whether it's anything that they basically believe is the property of non-Muslims, or the property of Muslims who are not Muslim enough, who are not good enough. Because you have to bear in mind, Malik bin Nuwaira, the man who was killed by Khalid bin Walid, the man whom he cut his head off and basically ate out of his severed head, he was actually Muslim. Like his only mistake is that he did not send the money to where they wanted it to be sent. So he had his money. He wanted to keep his money locally. He did not want to send that money to the state. He did not want to send it anywhere central. He just decided, I'm going to keep this money locally. I'm going to keep this money for my own community. And that was his mistake. He got his head chopped off, and he also had his wife taken as a sex slave. I want to show you the last response. When I mentioned this, the killing of Malik ibn Nuwaira, I want to show you what she actually said, because this is, again, yet another point where things get really, really scary. Let me just show you. So I'm getting of Malik ibn Nuwaira, and she said, I did not understand why you were telling me about it. It is true that it was a military error. So, sorry, we have to stop here. So if you behead a man and you eat out of his fucking skull, and you take his wife as a sex slave, that is a military error. And Khalid, she continues, and Khalid paid the zakat for Malik and his people back then. But we are all human and we're not infallible. Stop again, we need to stop. So if someone is driving while they're drunk and they kill someone, that is a mistake. They didn't mean to kill someone, but obviously they were drink driving, and that is actually punishable by law, so they have to go to prison. Khalid ibn al-Walid, when he killed this man, ate out of his head and took his wife as a sex slave on the same night. He did not even spend one day in any sort of punishment. So back then there was no jail. Back then, it was usually the violent stuff. So, they would, torture you a bit. They would do stuff like this. Or if, you get the death penalty, you would be basically beheaded. Khalid bin Walid, when he killed this man and again ate out of his skull and raped his wife and took her as a sex slave, he did not get any sort of punishment. The only sort of punishment he allegedly got from some, based on some sources, was that he was essentially removed from his position as leader of the army and, as leader of a certain community. And then after that, things were fixed and he got back to, being in a leading position again. But she is saying, she's calling the killing of a man, she's calling all these war crimes. We are all human and not infallible. So if I go and kill someone, would I say to the judge, I'm really sorry, this was just a military error, and I will pay them some money, and I'm human and I'm not infallible. Anyway, and then she continues, and I don't know because some accounts say his killing happened as a result of a misunderstanding, and I will not argue about something I'm not sure about. Again, the point of this, the reason I'm showing you this conversation is because this is actually the mainstream view. This is not some view that is mad. This is not some view that is, you know, uh, This is not some view that's really quite bizarre. This is not some view that doesn't really represent Muslims. Uh, this is a view. I really don't get it. Like, this is a view that somebody killed a man, ate out of his fucking head, and fucked his wife and took her as a sex slave. But that's a military error. That's just you cannot have a conversation with these people. Like, it's not. It's I can't talk to you and tell you that in 2026 you should be appalled by these crimes. Like, I cannot tell you this. Like, how do I even have this conversation with you? It's 2026. You are saying that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. She talked about Israel a lot, by the way. You are saying that the Jews are horrible human beings, and God made sure that they're scattered across the planet because they're fucking horrible. Fine. But you are just now saying that a man who killed a man, ate his out of his skull, and took his wife as a sex slave. It's just a human error. And we're not all infallible. So I don't really get it. The problem is, this is what most people do not understand. Even when you talk to Israelis, when you talk to people who live in the Middle East, when you talk to people who, even the heads of intelligence agencies. I once spoke to the head of Shabak, Ami Ayalon, and we were talking about, how Palestinians do not want peace. I said this to him, in 2019. He said Palestinians want peace. I said to him, Palestinians will kill you if they can. That was in 2019 in a synagogue in London. And obviously I was right, because October 7th happened. But the point is, people don't understand this mentality. You don't understand the mentality of an entire population of, almost 2 billion people who do not see anything wrong with war crimes of the most horrific crime, of, taking women as sex slaves, beheading people. It's unbelievable. They continue to glorify that stuff. They continue to glorify that stuff until this very day. Now, the problem I have also with all that, with that mindset, we have mosques in Britain, we have mosques in Canada, we have mosques in the US that are also named after my namesake, Khalid ibn al-Walid. So imagine, you're walking in London or you're walking in Toronto where there is a mosque named after Khalid ibn al-Walid, and you learn about Khalid ibn al-Walid. Okay, well, oh, Muslims love this guy. They named the mosque after him. So what did he do? He must have been an amazing guy. And then you learn that this man, he only killed a man, ate out of his skull, and took his wife as a sex slave. What does this tell you about Muslims who name a mosque after Khalid ibn al-Walid? There is, by the way, there is a massive street, a very prominent and major street in Alexandria in Egypt that is named the Khalid ibn al-Walid Street. Muslims continue to glorify the most horrific war crimes in every way imaginable. I don't really get it. I don't really get it. What can we do? Like, where do we go from here? Because again, there is no conversation with these people. And I think, quite frankly, it's it's futile. If I cannot talk to her because I cannot convince her that, you know, what do you say? Do you say, I'm really sorry, this was not just a matter of error, this was a horrific, horrible crime? Any adult in 2026 should be able to reflect on stuff that happened in medieval times and say, yeah, that was barbaric. That was back then. We should condemn it now and say, this is not okay. We condemn it. This was horrible. This is not a man we're going to glorify in any way, shape, or form. Anyway, back to me. So, my story is, again, I used to, go riding my horse by the pyramids and, go on top of a hill and imagine, that I can see the armies that I'm commanding because I'm Khalid and, I am named after Khalid ibn Walid. So one day I will invade non Muslim lands. Fucking mental. Anyway, but, I started to question all that stuff because I started to also see a community around me that was a community of liars, that was a community of thieves, that was a community of the most corrupt human beings you can imagine. I mean, look up Egypt. It's one of the most corrupt shitholes on the planet. So you realize, hold on a moment, if this is an Islamic society and they say that they are a society of believers, this is what Egyptians would tell you, we are a society of believers, then what kind of shit do you believe in? It doesn't make any sense. You are just pretending, you're cosplaying as a society with morals and values, but you're actually thieves, liars, corrupt, and you love terrorism and you glorify terrorism. So so I decided, I started to have a lot of questions. I started to also have questions around my own personal life. I loved, drinking. I loved partying. I loved, having girlfriends, and I was, young as a teenager. All this is all I wanted to do. I wanted to just, have fun. But I was told I was going to burn in hell for an eternity for having fun or for wanting to have fun. So I decided, you know what? Hold on a moment. I don't think I'm a fucking Muslim, really, because I don't believe in any of that shit. So this is, again, this is how it starts. And yeah, we'll I think we'll pick up the story later on because it's getting a little late for me. I've had very little sleep. But anyway, if you've been watching for almost an hour now, thank you. I'm very grateful for your time, and I'm very grateful that you're part of this conversation. I see a comment from Rebecca. Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, it is. It is like thanking the witch for turning you into a frog. It really is. It's actually a funny analogy. But yeah, next time we're going to continue this conversation. I think there is much more to reveal about what Muslims actually believe and how dangerous this is. I mean, imagine you live in London or in Toronto and you have a mosque right after you named after this man, and you don't know who this man is. But people worship in this mosque who glorify and love this man as one of the greatest people who walked this planet. I mean, imagine this. It's like going to sending your kids to a school next to a place where there is one of the most horrific pedophiles. That's basically kind of what we're discussing. So anyway, thanks again for your time, and